Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much for coming. Thanks for braving the cold. My name's Bo Wright. Tomorrow's my last day as executive director for Kennett Collaborative. We've hired another great executive director, so we're really excited about that. But thank you all for being here. This is our How We Build Matter speaker series. This is, I've lost count, but maybe 6 or 7 that we've had here. Really excited about tonight, and I'll introduce the speaker in a second. But a few housekeeping items. For those of you that have not been here, the bathroom is kind of out here, and if you just go back this way, straight ahead are restrooms. The talk will be for about 40 minutes. Though Thomas told me not to cut him off, so we'll see how well he does with that. So it'll be about 40 minutes, and we'll have time for question and answer afterwards. Tonight's talk is being recorded. It's also being translated into Spanish, so super grateful to have that. And thank you to Kennett Presbyterian Church for hosting us tonight. So I said I was excited for tonight's speaker. It's one of my best friends and someone who's taught me so much about sort of places and good design. Thomas Dougherty grew up on a farm close to the Ohio River on kind of the other side of Pittsburgh. Thomas is someone who doesn't tell you a lot about himself up front. You kind of learn these things. So I was on Amazon one day, and I've read a lot in terms of like regenerative agriculture and kind of sustainable farming. And this book shows up that has Dougherty as the last name, and it's like #1 in regenerative agriculture. And it was Thomas's parents that wrote that book. So that's kind of the world he grew up in. Joel Salatin wrote the foreword for that book. His parents kind of travel around with Joel Salatin. So he grew up on a farm and discovered this kind of love for cities and the human scale that we'll talk about tonight. Thomas has 2 master's degrees in architecture and urban planning from the University of Notre Dame. He lives in Westchester and serves on the planning commission there in Westchester. And again, has taught me so much just about spaces and these ideas of human scale, which I hope he'll enlighten us on tonight. So let's give a round of applause for Thomas Dougherty.
Thank you, Bo. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this evening. I've been researching and drawing alleys and innerblock spaces for years, so was excited when Bo asked me to come and talk with you all about it and about the possible revitalization of some of Kennett's alleys and innerblock spaces. And I'm going to start tonight's presentation with this question. What's the most photographed street in the United States? And I might ask you as an audience, except for Tara included in I think the invite for this, so I'll answer it myself. It's Acorn Street. And probably most of you have seen these images or even been there in person. This is Acorn Street in Beacon Hill in Boston. And everybody loves Beacon Hill. It's great. And so here you can see, in yellow, here is the street network forming the blocks here. So which one of these streets is America's most photographed streets? Is that even a street? This is at a scale that's unlike the rest of the streets. There's a garden here, so one whole side of the street is a garden wall. It's 18 to 21 feet wide. And when I say that, I'm talking about building face to garden wall here. It's non-continuous, right? It ends here, it ends here. The other side of the street is brick party wall row homes. So you might look at that and say, well, I think that's actually an alley. Whatever it is, it's the most photographed street in the United States. So what's the second most photographed street in the United States? I'm not sure. But if you look at the top 10, you just start Googling, you'll start to find the Philadelphia minor streets, Alfred, Sally, and others. So this is Irving Street and Quint Street, which is a great little intersection right here. For this photograph, I'm standing right there, so I'm not sure actually which one's Irving, which one's Quince. but it's 18 to 21 feet wide. And again, I'm measuring from building face to building face. So, what is that? That's me to the wall. It's non-continuous, right? It's not part of the rest of the street network, right? These are the plant streets. And so you can see the scale difference. It's like Beacon Hill in Boston and Acorn Street. And these were infill development that was built in the 17 and 1800s. And I happen to know that these two buildings right here are built by this guy right here in 1813. So we can keep going down this road. This is Circus Lane in Edinburgh. And if you Google, what's the most photographed street in England or Edinburgh, or most Instagram street, this is what will pop up. It's 18 feet wide. It's non-continuous. It's inside the block. I'm just going to hop back for a second. Note how all of these, right, they're nested in, they're inside of that block. It's framed by party wall homes that are touching each other, 2 stories, and garden wall. So this is actually garden wall. And that's the magic of innerblock development. And today I want to introduce the innerblock as a place where your Kennett Square's most beautiful human-scaled urbanism is waiting to be built. And I want to say that once you're inside the block, once I'm walking Acorn Street, in some sense, I could be anywhere. I could be in Beacon Hill, and it fits really well there. But it could also be in Kennett. Once I'm, here in Philadelphia, on Quince and Irving, I could be in Philly, or I could actually be in Germany. When you can bring the scale of urbanism down to 18 to 22 feet, the sense of place and location is so strong that in some sense you could be anywhere because your location is being defined by your environment. So innerblock urbanism, what is it? One insight is this observation by Douglas DeWine. He says, this is a former professor of mine, inside the city block, you find the intimacy of the hamlet, the quietness and sense of safety that can bring families with children into the city. Douglas had spent his entire career traveling the United States, Europe, the Middle East. He was working in Afghanistan for a number of years, Asia. And so this was an observation. This was telling us, when you go to cities, look for this. And here's a really clear example. This is called the God's House. This is in Bruges, in Belgium. So it's very clearly inside the block. Right here's your street. And this is nested completely itself. It's a little hamlet. It's a little village. And when you get inside of there, it takes up all of your experience. You could be in Bruges, or you could be in Kennett, or you could be anywhere. And these were developed actually for elderly, to age in the community. And so while I was sitting in here sketching, one of the buildings, I remember seeing an elderly woman leave one of these buildings with a walker, walk out, walk down this street to a corner store or a pharmacy that was right here. And while I was still sketching one of those buildings, she walked back with grocery bags. And the autonomy that she was able to have because she lived nested, right, with an ADA accessible unit inside of the city fabric. So, this is a really clear example. What are some characteristics? It's nested. I've been saying it's inside. It's at a human scale, right? Look at this opening right here. And transect shift, and that's just urban design language for it goes from city street to village or hamlet. It's that, and we talk about, village, hamlet, town, city. It's when you see one nested inside the other, and so I'm in a city and then I walk through an arched opening, all of a sudden I find myself in a village-like setting, which I experience in Philadelphia when I walk through places like this. So I want to walk you through a couple examples in Utrecht, the historic center of Utrecht in the Netherlands, of innerblock spaces. So this here is the block and street pattern of Utrecht. And this is just the typical street width here, 24-foot wide. And again, I'm measuring building face to building face. And just to be clear, how wide is this? I should have brought a measuring thing. I think that that's probably a little bit narrower than this church right here. And so here's a block and street pattern. And if you weren't looking for it, what you wouldn't know is that you're actually surrounded by all kinds of other interblock spaces. And so right here I've highlighted this street, which is actually 12 foot wide. And there's our intersection. If I'm walking down this street here, and I look to my left, I'll see that arched opening right there. And if I walk through there, I get onto this street. And again, this is an example of elderly housing in Utrecht in the Netherlands. Designed with zero thresholds, designed so that as people age, they can age into a place that's appropriate for them, but not outside the community. And not a place that's completely dependent on automobiles, but a place where they can walk to the needs of daily life right here on that street. So let's just walk through a few more places in Utrecht. This is the 7 Alleys. This is built in 1842 as workforce housing by this Catholic church right here. And as a note, attainable housing, workforce housing, affordable housing, traditionally you find that inside of a block. And so they're building these rows of homes, 12 foot from building face to building face. And it's long rows of homes, and halfway down there's little passages which connect all the communities there. And you step back out from there and you're walking along this main street here, and this is kind of what I think we expect to find in towns and cities. It's open, right? I can see the buildings, I can see across the canal here, and I'm a little bit more in familiar territory with, especially, the United States. And I'm going to keep walking down here, and I'm going to make a right on that street here. And now I'm on this street, and it's 12 foot wide. We're back to our 12 foot wide street. And what do you think that is? This is an intersection of two streets. Right there. And now we're down at 6 foot. So, nested. And I'm going to start using things to describe this, like passage entrance. So you walk through the passage, and what do you find? More elderly housing. This is shared garden court, and actually I think it's elderly housing on one side, and just units, market rate units on the other side of this shared garden courtyard. And so you find these garden courtyards with housing surrounding it inside of the block. So here we are looking at this. I think this is actually fairly recent development. This is not old historic stuff. This is built fairly recently. And now we're walking back out, right, and we're on this passage. So passage entrance, urban gateway. We're walking down here, back to the main road. And then we walk for about 20 feet, and then we make a right, and we're back on, this is where we were just a moment ago, right? We're walking down here. And we get on our main street here, and now we're at 24. And when you go from 12 feet to 24, you think, oh wow, that's a wide street now. But it's 24 feet, which is narrower than anything you've experienced outside of Acorn Street or Philadelphia. And you keep walking down this, and you make a right. You walk through this arched opening, which normally you wouldn't do, but I knew as an architect and urban designer I could get away with. And you find yourself in a park. Walk through the gateway. And that building right there, that's the elementary school. Nested, human-scaled, transect shift. There's a feeling of village inside here. Another thing Douglas would say, if you want to find the parochial school or the grade school, look inside the block. The quietness, the sense of safety, it's right adjacent to everyday life. And while I was in here, I was seeing, this is in the Netherlands, I was seeing all these kids on their bikes, biking in through the gateway, parking their bikes and going in. So characteristics of interblock urbanism, nested, human-scale transect shift. I want to talk about human scale for a second. And I want to talk about this principle, anchor urbanism and human scale, and start with this question: how is an interblock street of Bremen, Germany, like an Apple store? So here's King of Prussia Mall. You can kind of already read it here, right? We've got our anchor stores here and our fabric in between. And this is the historic center of Bremen, Germany. So to make it even more clear, here's our floor layout. And as an urban designer, it makes sense, but I'm sure it makes sense to everybody else. And whoever put together, the business plan here, they got the anchor stores together. And they made some kind of pitch, and they got the deal. And then they went and they got all the in-between stores, right, to fill up all the spaces in between. But guess what? Apple's actually one of the #1 anchor stores for malls across America. Apple is taking up less retail real estate than Gap Kids. When they built this, Apple wasn't even around. Apple is making $6,000 per square foot, which is more than triple the next highest grossing tenant. This is Bremen, Germany. It's the 11th largest city in Bremen with a population of about 500,000. And actually it stretches outside of this. But I wanted you to be able to see, way down into there, to see that. And as an urban designer, I can look at that and say, oh yeah, that's the historic center. You can see those like crenellation battlements, like protective areas. And you can see like, okay, there's the wharf and you're coming down, we got some bridges there. Yeah, that's the historic center. Most of the rest of that is probably built in the last 100 years. And so I can also note, tourism is so important for the economy of Europe that every tourist dollar is going to be spent in there. If you're traveling from America to Germany and you want to go to Bremen, you don't even know this stuff exists because you take a train in and you get out at a train station and it immediately pops you here because they know that's the only place you want to be. So there you are. And you can even look at this and say, like, see all that stuff? We don't want to go there. I can just tell that maybe that was bombed during the war, but those buildings aren't going to be creating the kind of spaces that you flew across the Atlantic for. Probably not this stuff either, not that stuff. And then, okay, look at the buildings there. Look at the spaces that they're creating. That's probably, the actual historic center of Bremen. And I've given this presentation once or twice. And yesterday, and I've just gone with my gut. I just know that these are bad. And yesterday I thought, I'll just find some pictures from Google Maps. It's worse than I thought. That right there is there. That right there is there. And yet this is, the 11th largest city in Germany, and people come to Bremen, Germany as tourists. So what are they coming for? And yeah, we were right. Look at that. There's our, marketplace and town hall and cathedral all around the square. So that's where, anchor urbanism. This is an anchor tourist spot. That's clear. Well, actually, the reason I was interested in Bremen was because I kept seeing images like these pop up on like travel social media sites. And so I assumed that Bremen, Germany was like Bruges, that it had like this historic medieval fabric that I could go explore and take photos of human-scaled spaces that were 18 to 22 feet wide. And when I put this slide together, I just put Bremen into Instagram, and these were the top 6 images that popped up. Look at that building. Oh yeah, and there. We're looking at the same little area. That's the #1 tourist attraction of Bremen, Germany. It's the last medieval street left in the city. It's 111 buildings, and it used to be, I think, a fishing village street or something like that. And it's the #1 tourist attraction of Bremen. And just for a little scale comparison, this is actually a walk from Westchester. I drew up our street in Bremen, Germany, and it fits within a typical residential block in Westchester. And I'm not proposing putting that in our residential block, but I think it's a good reminder, like the Apple Store, that it doesn't take much land to create anchor urbanism, to create a place where people travel across the Atlantic to come see. So what's our principle? Anchor urbanism. An anchor store doesn't necessarily have to have a large footprint. Neither does anchor urbanism. And I would assume that I would get 2 pieces of pushback, and I do when I show people an example like this, and they say, one, it's not appropriate inside my block, and I'm saying, okay, well, let's not put it inside your block, but as a scale comparison, I just dropped it in a figure ground of Kennett. So we got Broad and Union, so we're on. This is Broad. So it's the next block over, and I just dropped it inside the block at scale, right? So this is the same scale we were walking in Bremen here, and it fits in our block. And so it's not appropriate there. Fine, let's find a place. Maybe there is a place where something like this could be appropriate. And then another pushback would be, yeah, but we can't build anything like that anymore. This is a friend and colleague of mine down in Oklahoma. And this is a project that he built out of load-bearing masonry. He built some load-bearing masonry, which is all of our historic fabric in Kennett, right? This is bricks that are 3 or 2 thick. They hold their own weight. It's not linear. And buildings built like that can last for centuries, which is why we still have medieval fragments like this that people fly across the Atlantic to go see. And so he's building like that. And look at the similarities. It's not hard to build like that. So what allows this to be anchor urbanism, this little street? What allows it to be, the #1 tourist attraction of Bremen, Germany? Well, it's nested, which means it's protected from this street right here. Picture this street. What if we had one half of that street right here? And then we had this large opening here, and then we had that. Nobody would want to go there. It's protected from that large industrial street because it's inside of here. So transect shift. We went from this view, which I had shown you earlier, this industrial city that nobody's flying to, and we walked through here, and we found ourselves on a village street. And then human scale, the inner block. Because I can bring the scale down, I can build something that reflects the human body. Okay, anchor urbanism, human scale, and defining location. There's a saying, there are 3 things that matter in property values. Location, location, location. These 2 images are of the highest valued retail real estate in Palm Beach. So where is it? Palm Beach, Peruvian Ave, Worth Ave. The highest end retail real estate is here. It's inside the block. So defining location, defining property values. Human-scaled places, spaces like these define a place, even if they account for a very little part of the overall square footage or cost. And I would actually argue, if you can reduce the property that you're building on, you're trying to make a tourist attraction, you're trying to make beautiful, if you can reduce that size, that's in your favor. You're more likely to create a place that has a sense of location, that has a sense of place. And I just want to contrast this at that scale with what we typically build when we think of building public realm, public space, town square, and look at the capital and land required to define location, right? If property values are location, right? I can't just build that. I've got to build everything around that square for that to be a place. Very expensive, takes a lot of land. Very valuable. One is not saying one is better than the other, but look at that. As a minimum viable product, that's a lot easier to get to. Cost and land. Interblock urbanism. Humans are hardwired for human scale. So this is where we started. The magic of interblock development, humans are hardwired for human scale. And so what do we mean when we say human scale? I think it's ambiguous, and I also think that there's value in the ambiguity. So I'm going to start to try to define what I mean when I say human scale. Eyes, right? We've got a 60-degree cone of vision. They're all relatively in the same plane. So how do we perceive space? This is Acorn Street because when I'm on it, I'm in there, right? Like I'm in this room. When I'm on this street, I'm aware that I'm on a street. If you were missing half of these buildings, it would be like I'm in the church but the back wall's gone. So when I think about Kennett, and I think about the places, and we have a map that I'm going to look at later, that can contain space, that means that the buildings are close enough together that they can create a room of the city. So as human beings, when I talk about human scale, part of that is we're using the senses of our eyes, which means that we're using the walls to shape our conception of where we are. This is not, my special. This is not what I've studied. So I'm going to go through this briefly. But people like Ann Sussman in the last few years have been doing a lot of biometric research and using that with architecture and urbanism and different advancements in neuroscience to let them think about buildings and public spaces in a new way. So one theory is this, one reality, I guess, is stigmataxis, right? It's the instinct that we have to hug walls. So you can have lots of studies on animals, put animals in areas, and they're going to scurry around the edges of things. It's a safety thing. And humans do the same thing. And there are lots of images from these studies that I could have picked. Then I just thought, here's that really shitty image that we had earlier, and there's somebody next to it. I'm going to throw that up there. So humans, just by their nature, hug walls. We do it here in Kennett. We do it in Philly. We do it in Europe. We do it around the globe. There's a really amazing thing that happens when you bring the scale down. When you bring the scale down to about 18 to 22 feet, you're not going to walk right up the wall, right? So like 18 to 22 feet, that's like over there, and you end up walking the center of the street. It's one of the few times where people will naturally walk in the center of the street. Biophilia, that's our instinct, our draw to nature. Again, this is around the globe. The theory would be that our brains were hardwired back in the Sudan and they're not going to change anytime soon. So let's design for who we are. And this street would be a lot less interesting to walk down if it weren't for all the trees and plants and everything else. So old historic buildings, and they're great. But I think most of the draw, or half the draw, is all the plants that those buildings are importantly framing. It's framing a garden, right? And this is the last one to look at, but face pareidolia, and the human brain devotes more area of the brain to face recognition than any other visual object. Ann Sussman says, we're face-a-text before we're architects. From our very beginning, we're looking for faces. And so, a couple of interesting things with that, but one of those is that, again, back to our eyes, we're limited, so we're always looking for faces. And most of our brain, the majority of our brain, more brain power is based on that than anything else. So this is studies by Jan Gelb. He says the experience of faces only becomes interesting and exciting at a distance of less than 10 meters or 33 feet, and preferably at even closer ranges. So now think about the streets that we're used to. If I'm on the sidewalk on this side of the street, and there are people on that side of the street, that's far enough away that I don't have that same connection. Whereas if you can bring that scale down, there's a much tighter, intimate encounter that's possible. So this is actually meaning that we find faces in things, right? So clearly emojis work, we got that there. And lots of studies will have people looking at things and finding faces in things. And one of the things with traditional architecture, and one of the reasons why people promote it for that, is that it's vertical and symmetrical, and so you can find faces in traditional architecture in a way that you can't in modern. And so I was going to find one of those images, and then I looked at the image I had on the screen, and all of a sudden I saw a face. So I just left it. So it's the verticality and symmetry of traditional architecture that lets us see that. What do we have here? Ray, what's on the screen? And according to Ann Sussman, car designers have known this for a very long time. They've been watching eye tracking. They're designing faces and things. Cars, if I'm going to buy that one or that one, that's partly an emotional decision. They're drawing faces into things. I was reading a couple articles in preparation. I've never shown slides like this before. And it was interesting to see this right here. This was advertisers looking at, hey, what happens when I make a perfume ad that looks like that, and what happens when I make a perfume ad that looks like that. And this gets, obviously, the vast majority of the eyes and clicks and everything else. But humans are hardwired for faces. And why am I going through all this? Basically, what does human scale mean? It's ambiguous, but there are aspects of it that are deeply ingrained into who we are as persons. It's not, Kennett does their human scale this way, and other people do their human. There's aspects of that, but there are deep underlying principles about our instincts. And as an urban designer and architect traveling around the world, we were looking for patterns. And you can find some of the same patterns in Kennett, in Philadelphia, in Germany, in Asia. And that's what we pick up on. And so innerblock is one of those. And these characteristics are some of those. So it's taken me a long time to get here. We're finally at Kennett. And I couldn't help it add a few slides before we talk about Kennett. So this is Kennett Square. And all these are at the same scale. Does anybody know what this one on the left is besides Ray?
I have no idea. It's Westchester.
It's Westchester. Does everybody know what this one is? You don't need to know. Isn't that interesting? Seeing these at the same scale. This is, the seat of the Roman Empire for hundreds of years, and the old imperial walls are off here. And it's, relatively close to the same size as Kennett. And maybe 6 months ago, I happened to be speaking with officials from Westchester, Kennett Borough, and Count Township, all within about a month of each other. And they all said, we're built out. Like our boroughs, our municipalities, we're built out. And we're also dealing with a parking crisis. So let's not talk about more development here. And so I thought that's interesting. I think that there's definitely some truth to those concerns, and that needs to be valued. And so I used the most recent census data. Westchester is 1.85 square miles with a population of 18.6, though I think in Borough Hall they say we're closer to 22. So you probably are higher than 5'9" as well. That means there's 15.8 people per acre, and our census says there's 2.24 persons per household. So these are the numbers that urban designers are looking at. That means I'm looking at 7 units per acre in Westchester. Kennett Borough, your census says you're at 6,000. You got 2.62, so slightly bigger households. You're just about half of the units per acre that we are. And then Count Township, we're also built out. No more room for development, and they're fully parked. They got 1 unit per acre. And so when you think about Westchester, I think these boroughs, I think there's absolutely truth to that. But I think what we have to remind ourselves is that these boroughs are not homogeneous, right? There's a huge amount of diversity within the borough. And so if you go to the earliest part of Westchester, this is all Westchester. If you go to the earliest part of Westchester, the 1769 to 1900, these are all the same scale. I'm using the same red box. I got 40 lots in here. Not only that, this is actually in the commercial business district, so there are a lot of these that are being used for offices with lots of parking. If I take that down south a little bit between Sharpless and Price, I got 18 lots up here, and then I go to the northwest quadrant, I got 12 lots. So all that to say, what's happening here with parking and density isn't necessarily, throughout Westchester. It's a diverse place. Okay, back to Kennett finally. And the magic of innerblock development, we're hardwired for human scale. Here are our characteristics. I've outlined our alleys, or Kennett's alleys right there. And actually, first I'm going to talk about your base space. Still haven't talked about your alleys. So I think that these are not open for development. This is the NBS, right?
Yeah, I think right in that area. I think it might be one over, but yes. That's,
okay.
Yeah, that whole parcel.
So first I want to talk about hypothetical interblock opportunities of development in your larger pieces of land in town. 9 months ago, former professor Phil Bess asked me to spend a couple days in South Bend with a grad studio that was working on a design project in South Bend. They had a whole block of land. It was a church, a school, another church, a couple homes, and the design charrette was, hey, how do we make the most of this block given a new form-based code that had been passed? And so he asked me to come, and I talked about nested human scale transection. And so they developed around the perimeter of the block like you'd expect, and in town they're shaping the streets. But they also came in with this lane, and all credit to the students, they did a fabulous job. I was just there for a couple days chit-chatting, talking about this stuff. But when I saw this, I was blown away by the scale that they had brought in, because they had brought in that Acorn Street scale. They brought in that Circus Lane scale. And then they kept going. So here's a little video of the design. It's only 2 minutes, but it's worth watching. So none of that would have been legal, right, in South Bend, because the South Bend street's already formed. And the codes and the zoning were all about how do we approach that street? How do we front that street? But what these students did in South Bend is they created more of South Bend, right? Kennett, or Westchester, you know, it's all these streets and alleys, which we've inherited from previous generations. But these students decided to add more to South Bend. They were going to give South Bend just a couple more short streets, like they used to do in Philadelphia, like they used to do in Westchester, like they used to do in Kennett. And in the end, they created a block, which is that size right there, which isn't actually that different from some of your larger blocks over there. It had 80 dwellings, and it had 107 off-street parking spots and 63 on-street parking spots. Thanks. Okay, finally, we're at Kennett's Alleys. And the first thing I want to say is that, or point out, is that this is that minor street. You know, these are the minor streets in Philly, alleys here. These are drawn at the same scale. So we're looking at spaces that are roughly the same scale. This is I'm going to only speak about this briefly. This is a book I wrote with Strong Towns a year and a half ago. It's free, it's online, and it has a whole history of alleys and alley revitalization, all the stuff that I'm not going to get to this evening. But to really talk about alleys and make a judgment call. We have alleys, we use them for these things. Who's to say that we change any of that? Why would we change any of that? And I'm not here to convince you to do any of that, but I think it's important to know the history, to know why it's shaped the way it is, how we've inherited it, and how do we bring that to the 21st century. So Philadelphia is the first modern city in the United States. And it was really an experiment. London burns down in 1666, and immediately the leading architects of Europe came up with plans to rebuild it. Christopher Wren has this famous plan for the rebuilding of London. They don't do that. But a lot of people that were then coming to the States used those plans to think about what should the perfect city look like. And so I want to point out these lots. Look how big these lots are. So these blocks are larger than that block I was just showing you. And look how few lots they have right here. And they were trying to avoid fire. They were trying to avoid disease. They were trying to avoid so many bad things that went hand in hand with London at the time. But that's not the way it developed. Let's just jump back real quick. So this is the wharf. Here are the lots. Just keep a mental image of those lots. Boop. Look how much they were subdivided. You know, William Penn is saying, let's build in the center of our lots, make sure that, you know, it's a green country town, it's not going to be burned. And then people built just like they had built in London. And not only that, the yellow here, these are all the planned streets that William Penn and Thomas Home were drawing. And all the red, this is what all the local builders were doing. They would come in, they would say, hey, we need attainable or affordable housing. And they start cutting in all of their own streets. So this is the modern cutting edge street. Like this was a planned street in Philly, and this is the unplanned. So this is, we're less prone to fire, disease, because we're providing light and air. Plenty of room for carriages, which are new on the scene of, you know, urban scene. And this is the vision of the future, right? Nobody else is doing wide streets. We want wide streets. And this is the typical problematic, everywhere we were coming from in Europe was like this. Not only that, this 1822 foot wide, if you go back in time, go to Rome. Go to the cities in France. Even go to Pompeii. Same freaking dimensions. 1822 feet wide. So our modern cutting edge streets were not going to be that. And so the Trinity houses in Philly cut up, right, they cut all the new lanes through the blocks. This is a 400 by 400 block. Isn't that amazing? So this is the block. They did what we'd never get away with doing today, add all those streets and all the little Trinity houses. Between 1840 and 1850, the population of Philadelphia grew by 60%. This is a quote from the time, 1904. I thought Philadelphia had no bad conditions, that it was a city of homes, yet the intricate network of courts and alleys, which the interior of the blocks are covered is a conspicuous feature. Fire, disease, all the things that they didn't want that was back in London was starting to appear again. And so by the late 1800s, early 1900s, laws were being passed, mostly building codes. They didn't have zoning at the time, but building codes to make sure that there were side yards and that people would stop building inside of the blocks. And today, all that stuff that, you know, is going on here, that fits in our cavity wall. So this is 1900, and this is that same building, a picture I took last year. So this, you know, there was no plumbing, there was no electrical, there was no gas. You know, picture that, the night soil removal, the wells. But now, it's one of the prettiest streets in America. So we had this conception of wide street. And I want to talk about, so how did the country, how do we all end up with these wide streets across the entire country? Well, it was the modern thing, and Thomas Jefferson wanted to move quickly, well, all the founding fathers wanted to move quickly across the country. And so they came up with the Continental Grid. So we went from meridian and parallel here, to check, to township, to section, to city block, and this goes to 8 city blocks. Right, we platted the entire West after about 1800 with that. And then the block, this is the Chicago block, has 66-foot wide streets, 330 from center line to center line, and then 24-foot alley. Look at that. That human scale showed up again. So we platted the entire country, but they left one public right-of-way at a human scale. So here's Kennett. Here are the alleys. I love this ADU. You have an ADU ordinance which allows for these old carriage houses to be refabbed and to have people living in them, which one offers place for elderly loved ones, family members, but also actually it could be rented out to somebody in your community and offset the mortgage for people who own a lot in town. I haven't walked many of your alleys, but Bo walked me down here, I think last summer, and I love this. Is this Church Alley? You have this intersection right here. This is from Charleston. This is Capitol Street. It's one of the most beautiful new developments in the United States, and it's essentially built, it's inside of a block. It's at the scale of an alley. This is Earl's Court. This is Earl's Court, essentially alley development. This is Ray's own development, Ray Ott here. This is in Westchester. It's another alley development. And he went to Darlington Street, and he took the dimensions of the townhomes and the street, and he came back and he replicated it in the alley. I wrote down what I want to say on that slide here. Okay. Modern infrastructure needs wide streets, which we have already. So here's our block. Modern infrastructure needs wide streets. First responders need the wide streets. Amazon delivery, general traffic, your off-street parking, all need our existing wide streets. But there's room inside your block for an urban oasis. The most photographed street in your town or city is waiting to be built. Thank you.
Any questions for Thomas? Just raise your hand if he can call on you. I think Brian definitely has to have a question because he came in late. So, but Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, and forgive me, I've spent the last couple of decades being a professional skeptic, so I always have a question. And the one picture you showed of Church Alley is actually my property on the right-hand
Oh,
side.
fabulous.
But it's an older picture that I rehabbed that building.
I didn't have a good picture with what Google Maps had. Yeah.
The problem I think we faced in Kennett is we've got maybe 20, 24 blocks of alleys. I don't know if you count.
Can we get
my rough estimate is around a couple dozen blocks
Yeah.
of alleys in Kennett.
Yeah, right.
On that scale. Because of zoning requirements, because of other things, you're sort of limited development. The typical lot on Broad or Union Street is 150 by 50. So you've got 150 from Center Street to Center Valley. And most of those places have buildings on them now of some sort. Aren't very many with empty rear lots, if you will, backyards. So I can see that on an individual basis that you can do something. But we also have a lot of infrastructure that runs through those alleys.
Right.
All PICO's high voltage lines run through the alleys. Our garbage pickups are generally through the alleys. So you gotta have room for the garbage trucks that actually back up Church Alley, which scares the heck out of me. And the other thing is, we have parking requirements for homeowners. So if you have to have off-street parking, it kind of limits what you can do in building. You can't build a building too close to their wires. There are all sorts of complications. Where I think we could make the best use of this, and Bo, I know you've worked on this with your proposal for 600 South Broad. And the other major opportunity is the MDF site that we have in Kent, which is 20 plus acres, which is one of the reasons your calculation may have been a little bit off because we have that giant hole in the ground.
Oh, we've got some big ones too in Westchester.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I know the lots. So the question is, do we try to do something with the existing alleys that add density? I don't think you're going to get a lot of commercial activity. I think it's just going to be, you want to walk through those alleys? Or do we apply this to the open areas within the borough that add the ability to create a new space in Kennett that might draw more people in? And if we do we do some of that in commercial so we can draw, dollars in as well? So,
I have two thoughts.
okay.
One of the beauties, I think, about innerblock development is that it's nested and it doesn't have nearly as much impact on the rest of the borough, on the rest of the neighborhood, the rest of the city. And so I would assume, looking at a place like this, that the vast majority of out. You don't have very many alleys. We have a lot of alleys in Westchester. But I would assume the vast majority of alleys wouldn't be suited, right? But Bremen, Germany has one little tiny street. And I'm not saying that we need to even build like that, and the reason I actually put this image at the end is because you see, we have some buildings over here, but look how lovely this is. There aren't buildings on this side. It's gardens, walls, trees, but they're framing that edge. And so I think the two thoughts were, one, it's probably not appropriate or applicable in the vast majority of cases, but it only takes a tiny bit of land to create something really special, and maybe it's not on an alley, maybe it's somewhere else. And two, it could be done at a really low density. So Charleston never had the industrial pressures that we had up here in the north, the industrial city pressures. It was agriculturally based. And so you don't see the same kind of Philadelphia minor street cramming in Trinity House thing. And I think it's a good vision for how we can make the most of our residential alleys. We have some examples of alleys in Westchester, which I love, and there are actually no structures on it. It's a hedge, and then a wall, and then someone put a tree. But I think the critical part, and that my whole book is basically about this, the critical part is how do we define that space? So I think there are lessons to be learned from the innerblock stuff that actually doesn't even include building new buildings. Just let's make some damn nice hedges, you know, great archways. Yeah, and then the other one is, yeah, an NVS site, like that's huge. You could do all kinds of things there. But if you could find the right little sliver of land, there are golden opportunities there as well.
And having spent 4 years in South Bend, the part where it snowed, and your video is very typical.
So, if we get outside the borough, talk about Southern District, it'd be interesting to hear your opinion on why things like this don't happen across Southern District County, or even Central County in general.
So, for example, the design the students in South Bend came up with?
Sorry.
Like the design that the students in South Bend came up with? Like the little video?
Or Bruges, Paris.
Yeah, right. Okay, well, and that's why I think going back to the history is so important, right? It's so hard, once you, St. Augustine, right? It's our oldest city in the United States, or our oldest town in the United States. St. Augustine for it, you know, St. Augustine. St. Augustine was founded by the Spanish, and then 2 years later, somebody, I forget who it was, came and burned it. And they built up on the same exact street lines. And then more people came and burned it. It got burned like 6 times in the first 10 years. And they kept going up on the same street lines. Same with London, right? 1666, the whole city burns to the ground. And people come up with these modern, cutting-edge designs, which are really what designed Philadelphia. They went up same street lines. Once something gets put in place like that, it's very permanent, I think. And it's really hard to get back public right-of-ways. And so the Continental Grid went across the states 200 years ago, and we're working within those dimensions today. So I think that's part of it. Obviously, zoning codes are a huge part of it. Building codes are a huge part of it.
Is the question, though, why we don't see it elsewhere? Is that kind of the question? Outside of the boroughs?
So let's pick the flats. You don't need the flats. You could have done something like this instead of the flats, or Red Clay Manor, or a luxury lots being built down the street or whatever. Why don't we even consider things like this?
Inertia. We have the way things have been done. When was the last time Ray did an excellent job streamlining our zoning code? But 90%, 95% of what is in our zoning code today in Westchester is what was put in our zoning code in the 70s. So that's 50 years ago. That language is still the vast majority of the language that we are governed by today. It's very hard to change things. The inertia is incredible.
So let me be provocative. It's because the majority of the population white population doesn't want this.
The markets would tell you you're wrong. Go to Philadelphia and look at the minor streets. Go to, so this is a great example of this Capitol Street in Charleston. They took a block and they carved out this little alley. Brian Moore did it, right behind you. And they built these stunning little homes. The property values here are 2 or 3 times what the neighboring ones, the ones they basically touch. People respond to this, markets respond to this. It's very difficult to do.
Somehow that message doesn't seem to be getting through, in my opinion.
Yes.
Oh, I think the message really is getting through. I mean, people have these big McMansions, all over Chester County, and then it seems like now these same people want to move back into the boroughs and kind of, as you said, the more dense spaces where they can walk places and that thing. I mean, I think we're getting ripe for this happening more and more. And, maybe the space is even for seniors or something, empty nesters. I mean, I think there's a huge market for it.
One of the things I think about with Westchester very often is, our comprehensive plan talks about everything that contributes to the character, forms the character of Westchester. What makes Westchester or Kennett such special places? And then I think, okay, what are the buildings and developments that got passed in the last 50 years? Almost none of them contribute to the character of place. And so, you just said it, Kennett is going to be under a huge amount of pressure to build. And so I think this is the time to find both the framework to make that building actually contribute, have the confidence to say, hey, some developments can actually contribute to the character of place, and let's find the appropriate place for them. And so your comment earlier about the alleys, maybe it's not the alleys. You probably use your alleys. So this was the title was a vision for alleys. And that is, a lot of my research has been put toward that. But maybe it's not existing alleys. Maybe you find areas in here, maybe it's the new development areas over here, and you cut new alleys. Maybe that's where you're developing. But let's find a framework and a vision for the city and the town so that developers aren't the ones that are shaping that vision. Or I say developer like it's a bad thing, but so that the developers have the appropriate vision. Okay.
In trying to do this,
Yeah.
my experience has been some of the big pushback comes from fire, emergency services, trash. As an example, when we did that project we're talking about in Westchester, that was back in 1984.
Yeah.
Light Center. If I did that today, they would send that over to the fire chief, and he'd say, I can't get a company, and I can't turn it around.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just telling you, that's the kind of, when we're doing stuff in Phoenixville, it's the same kind of pushback that you get a lot of.
And I appreciate that pushback.
What's that?
I appreciate that pushback.
No, I know. And what happened in like, in the example of Phoenixville, when we've done some dense projects like that, I didn't personally, that's the plan. A lot of the streets, the borough won't take. They have to make it private. They said, we're not maintaining it, we're not going to try and plow snow on the street.
Right.
I'm just throwing out what some of the impediments are.
Absolutely.
Trying to introduce these ideas.
And that final little thing, the reason I read it is because it deals with aspects of that. I'm grateful for our wide streets. We need big infrastructure. We need room for our trash trucks, our fire trucks, our first
I
responders,
didn't catch you put them on.
our Amazon delivery. But in some sense, like the Barcelona block, we can turn aspects of it inside out. And we can find opportunities. Not necessarily in our existing fabric right here, but Kennett is you have 1 square mile, and sometimes that seems limiting, and then I put 1 square mile next to ancient Rome. There's so much opportunity there. And so I think, Ray, that's all absolutely true. It's good points. But there are opportunities to develop in ways that are close enough to that fire truck that you can get the hose back there. ADU.
When you first showed that image, I didn't notice you put those vehicles.
Yeah, I knew what you were going to say. Right now I'm working on a project in Durham, North Carolina. We can stretch a hose 150 to 200 feet, depending on, I'm not sure what's depending on. I heard 150 to 200 feet from the fire lane. So if you look at the South Bend co-op, I'm sure they were thinking of that. They got the parking in there. They have a one street that's big enough for one municipal trash truck to go through. I'm sure they made it so the fire truck can get in there and get their hose in there. So those are definitely things that we have to be very cognizant of and work with those municipal leaders. But we see good examples of things being built, like Brian's Capitol Street down in Charleston. He's going to say, that's not mine, that he worked on it.
And maybe since I'm outgoing, I'll make a provocative point for Kennett. I've looked, so Strong Towns did this analysis, and this is maybe counter to Thomas's point that he just made. And so I did it for Kennett Square in the Kennett area. It's like 87% of the responses that our fire trucks have are to auto-related accidents, which guess where all those happen? On the white streets. So we are building, it's induced demand that we're creating. We're building wide streets, which encourage more accidents, and we're building bigger and bigger fire trucks, which service those wide streets. At some point, you have to say, what are we doing? We are spending millions of dollars on huge fire trucks and creating spaces where they're responding to. So at some point, you kind of have to say, we're doing something wrong here. And if you look at each municipality and they have these numbers, you can find that the majority of the responses are to auto accidents. So.
I mean, on the trash truck point, in Kennett here, trash service is a private service that the borough is hiring. If we simply have narrower streets, it's up to who takes the bid, right? We are dictating the conditions of the traffic. They're either going to say, we're not going to get it on some of these smaller blocks, or they're going to take a contract overall and buy a small truck. And there are small trucks that spent years in Philadelphia.
I was about to say.
They get them down those small streets and those benefit commissions. Yeah, so that's another consideration. We are the ones of the community dictating these things, right? We create the world we live in. We're not subject to others all the time.
I gave Bo a tour of the Philly minor streets one time, and we started walking down the street, and there was a trash truck. We're running after the trash truck, taking all sorts of photos. Look, and that's a 6'6" wide car path.
Maybe time for one more question, I think. Andy, if it's okay, we'll go with the woman to your right.
Thank you. I know this is getting into minutia and you're not quite at that point yet, but I'd like to just throw this out that you might consider engaging a number of artist studios in these spaces. The Chester County is a very art-oriented county, as you well know, and the Delaware Contemporary down in Wilmington on the riverfront has 26 studios that are open every month, and they have had a waiting list for those studios ever since they've opened. So there would be no problem. And artists are used to going into raw space. They actually prefer it. They don't need anything fancy inside. They need a slop sink and electricity, and that's about it. They don't provide everything else. But I think it would give a good reason for a lot of people across Chester County to come to this area that you're talking about.
What a great idea. And imagine finding that little chunk of land, I'm not going to flip back to it, that little Bremen Street. It's not on that many acres, right? You could find that somewhere tucked away, the back of a couple lots, and build a little, maybe a half-street version, just like half the length, but full of artist studios. That'd be amazing, with maybe living in quarters for them above or something.
We have an artist now who is above the beautiful rug shop, whatever that's called. I'm not sure. Yeah, and there's an artist on the second floor. A lot of people go in there just to see the artist's work.
I think that's a great idea.
Well, let's give another round of applause for Thomas. I think there's a QR code here on my right for Thomas's book.
If you just,
If not, you can visit Thomas's website, which is innerblock.org, and find the book there. Thomas will be around.
it's just a downloadable PDF.
So, thank you all for coming.